Andrew Carnegie. Now, there are few names in history that stir up such a wild mix of, well, admiration and total controversy. This was a man of absolutely staggering wealth, but also just as much complexity. So let's dive into the story of a man who rose from literally nothing to become one of the most powerful people in American history. Okay, to really wrap your head around his wealth, just look at this number. At his absolute peak, right after he sold his company, Andrew Carnegie's personal net worth was the equivalent of 2% of the entire GDP of the United States. I mean, that's a level of wealth that's almost impossible to even imagine today. So the question is, how on earth did he get there? And, maybe more importantly, what did he do with it all? And that right there brings us to the central paradox of his life. Was he a ruthless tycoon who built an empire on the backs of his workers? Or was he this world-changing philanthropist who truly believed the rich had a duty to make society better? The truth, as we're about to see, is that he was somehow both. So, in this explainer, we're going to try and unpack that very paradox. We're going to explore the two completely different sides of this historical titan, from his incredibly humble beginnings to the brutal tactics he used to build his empire, and then finally, to the very complicated legacy he left behind. Let's start at the very beginning, because Andrew's story doesn't begin in America. It starts across the Atlantic, in Scotland, where his family was actually crushed by the same industrial revolution that would, ironically, later make him his fortune. In 1848, his family fled to Pittsburgh, hoping for a better life, but they arrived with pretty much nothing. Young Andrew had to drop out of school to help support them, starting in the miserable heat of a boiler room. But this kid was relentlessly ambitious. He managed to land a job as a telegraph messenger, and his incredible skill caught the eye of a man named Thomas Scott, a big-shot manager at the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. And you see, this wasn't just about running messages back and forth. No way. As a messenger boy, he made it his mission to memorize the faces and names of every single important business person in the entire city. He was networking from day one, literally building a mental map of Pittsburgh's power structure. It was this incredible mix of pure hard work and really sharp strategic thinking that just defined his rise. His time at the railroad, it was basically a masterclass in business. With Thomas Scott as his mentor, he learned exactly how to run a massive corporation and even made his first smart investments. And all of this set the stage for him to build his very own empire, an empire forged in steel. So, the secret sauce to his business genius was a strategy we now call vertical integration, and he was absolutely brilliant. See, instead of just building iron bridges, he went out and bought the iron mines to supply his own materials. This gave him total control over the whole process and, of course, massively boosted his profits. Then he used his old railroad connections to sell rails. Each business fed the others, creating this powerful, self-sustaining loop. And the man was a master salesman. Get this, when he built his first huge steel plant, he didn't name it after himself. Oh no, he named it after the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, who just happened to be his biggest potential customer. It was such a shrewd move. It showed public appreciation, and what do you know? It immediately secured him a massive order for 2,000 steel rails. This wasn't just a gimmick, it was a core part of his strategy. But even as his fortune just exploded, there was this conflict brewing inside him. He really hated the company of other wealthy New Yorkers. He even called them scoundrels. He wrote this note to himself, promising that he would quit the money game when he turned 35 and dedicate his life to philanthropy. Well, that was a promise he wouldn't keep for many, many years. The lure of the empire was just too strong. And to build that empire, he completely embraced a do-whatever-it-takes mentality. I mean, he basically perfected the playbook of the Gilded Age tycoon. He brought on the notoriously ruthless Henry Clay Frick as his right-hand man, and together, they replaced workers with machines, they spread nasty, false rumors about their competitors' products to scare off customers, and they would slash prices to bleed their rivals dry before buying them up for pennies on the dollar. This absolute ruthlessness would come to a head at one of his biggest steel plants in Homestead, Pennsylvania. And what happened here would stain his reputation forever. It really is the darkest chapter of his life. You see, in public, Carnegie was writing articles championing workers' rights and saying how important unions were. But in his own factories, his actions told a completely different story. He was constantly pushing to cut wages and increase hours, all while doing next to nothing to improve the incredibly dangerous conditions. And when I say dangerous, I mean the conditions were terrifying. Just let this number sink in for a moment. In 1898, a full 9% of all steelworkers in the industry died on the job. It was one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, and workers felt like they had no choice but to organize, just to survive. So here's the play-by-play of how it all went down. Carnegie, very conveniently, travels to Scotland, leaving his attack dog, Henry Frick, to handle the quote-unquote dirty work. Frick immediately demands longer hours for less pay. When the union refuses, he locks all 10,000 workers out of the plant. Then he hires a 300-man private army, the Pinkertons, to seize the factory. The stage was set for a violent, bloody confrontation. When the armed Pinkertons arrived, they were met by thousands of angry, striking workers. To this day, nobody really knows who fired the first shot, but the result was a full-blown battle. By the end of the day, 9 workers and 7 Pinkertons were dead. The Homestead Strike had become the Homestead Massacre. In the end, the state militia was called in, the factory reopened, and the strike was completely crushed. The workers were forced to come back with even lower pay and even longer hours than before. Carnegie got what he wanted, lower costs, but his reputation as a friend of the working man was destroyed forever. He was widely seen as a coward who just used Frick as a scapegoat. Despite all the controversy, Carnegie Steel just kept growing. It eventually produced more steel than the entire nation of Great Britain. But by 1901, Carnegie was almost 70, and he decided he was finally ready to fulfill that promise he made to himself all those decades earlier. It was time for his second act. He sold his entire company to his rival, the famous financier J.P. Morgan, for the absolutely astronomical sum of $480 million. The deal was supposedly sealed with just a simple glance at a number scribbled on a piece of paper. And just like that, overnight, Andrew Carnegie became the single richest man in the world. And then he dedicated the rest of his life to giving that fortune away. He funded over 2,500 public libraries all over the globe because he always credited libraries for his own education. He built iconic institutions like Carnegie Hall. He was so committed to this idea that he left no fortune at all to his family. And this wasn't about ego either. His name only appeared on a small fraction of the buildings he actually funded. So after a life of such incredible extremes, how are we supposed to make sense of his legacy? He was a man who was, as one source put it, as complex as he was rich. And really, when you lay it all out, the case for him being both a hero and a villain is pretty compelling. I mean, the case for villain is strong. His abusive labor practices, the way he ruthlessly destroyed competitors, his public hypocrisy, and the fact that his actions directly led to the deaths of workers. But the case for hero is just as compelling. He dedicated the last 2 decades of his life to philanthropy on a scale no one had ever seen. He funded education and the arts, and he popularized this idea that the wealthy have a moral obligation to give back. And that brings us right to our final question. And honestly, there's no easy answer here. Andrew Carnegie's life forces us to ask whether the good he ultimately did can ever outweigh the harm he caused along the way. How should we remember a man who built a better world, but built it on such a ruthless foundation? That's the paradox he leaves for all of us to think about.